My name is Natalie. And before I even took a sip of champagne, my mother leaned in, her voice like ice behind a forced smile. You ruined her wedding just by showing up, she said. No yelling, no scene. Just a whisper that landed harder than any public outburst ever could. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply smiled, set my glass down, and walked out of the room with quiet steps. What they didn't know was that I wasn't there to be seen. I was there because someone asked me to come. Someone they never imagined. And what happened after I walked away is the part no one saw coming. I hadn't planned to attend the wedding. Honestly, I didn't even think I was invited. My sister Olivia and I had grown distant over the years, but things truly broke after last Thanksgiving. That was the day my mother looked across the dinner table and told me I always made things harder, like I couldn't just follow the script like Olivia did. Olivia stayed close, got engaged to a man they adored, and posted everything on Instagram like a perfect highlight reel. I moved to another city, focused on my graduate research, and showed up to holidays alone without a ring or a corporate title. To them, that meant I was drifting, disappointing, complicated. So when I didn't receive a wedding invitation, I didn't call. I didn't ask. I told myself it was better that way. That maybe some distances were meant to be respected. But if I'm honest, it still stung. Not because I wanted to be celebrated, but because it confirmed what I'd suspected for years. Somewhere along the way, I had been quietly written out of the family narrative. As the wedding got closer, my phone stayed silent. Olivia posted dress fittings, venue walkthroughs, bridal brunches. Our cousins liked every post. My mother left doting comments, always with too many heart emojis. I watched from a distance like someone peering through a glass window at a life they were no longer part of. I told myself I was fine with it, that I had my own things to focus on. But every time I opened my inbox, I still half expected an invitation. Something, anything, but it never came. No message, no call, just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel like forgetfulness, but intention. I wasn't overlooked. I was excluded. And maybe they thought I wouldn't notice. Maybe they assumed I'd stay away quietly, just like I'd done with everything else. And for a while, I was going to. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived. No envelope markings, no return address. Just my name written in a slightly slanted hand, like someone had hesitated before pressing pen to paper. Inside was a single sentence. I hope you come. She'll understand one day. It was signed with just one initial. M. It took me a few seconds to connect the dots. Marcus, Olivia's fiancé. We hadn't spoken much beyond family dinners and brief hellos, but when we did, he paid attention. He asked about my thesis work, remembered that I hated. The night wrapped around me like something sacred. And for the first time in years, I wasn't pretending to be okay. I was just gone, not in shame, not in defeat, but in quiet, deliberate freedom. Let them have their version of events. I had finally stepped out of the frame they built without me. I had just reached the edge of the lot when I heard footsteps behind me. Quick, uneven, someone running but trying not to draw attention. I didn't turn around. I figured it was a guest looking for their car or maybe a caterer on a smoke break. But then I heard my name. Natalie. It wasn't shouted, just spoken. Firm, certain. I stopped, slowly turned, and there he was, Marcus. His jacket unbuttoned, his tie loose, his dress shoes covered in dust. He looked at me like someone seeing something slip through their fingers. You're really leaving? He asked, catching his breath. I looked at him and gave the smallest nod. I wasn't supposed to be here, remember. His face tightened. That wasn't me. I invited you. You know that, right? I didn't answer. I just stood there barefoot on gravel, holding my silence like a shield. He took a step closer. I saw you during the ceremony. You looked like the only honest person in the room. You didn't try to pretend, and you didn't stay for the performance. That meant something. I felt my throat tighten but said nothing. Because for the first time in a long time, someone had followed me, not to stop me, but to see me. He stood there, not filling the silence with excuses or apologies, just breathing beside me like the world hadn't noticed we were both missing. I asked quietly, "Why did you send that letter?" He looked at me like it was the most obvious question in the world. "Because I've seen you, Natalie. Every time we were in the same room, I saw how they overlooked you, how you disappeared just to make them comfortable, and still you showed up, even when they didn't deserve it, even when they pretended you weren't there. That kind of grace doesn't come from weakness. It comes from strength." I didn't know what to say. No one had ever called it grace before. Most people just called it being difficult or distant. He went on, "Olivia is many things, but she's never had to question whether she belonged. You have. And you still carry yourself with more honesty than anyone I know. I wanted someone real at my wedding. I wanted you there because I knew you'd see it for what it was. All the layers. The truth behind the decorations." I looked at him and realized this wasn't about pity. It was about something much rarer. Recognition. And in that moment, I didn't feel like the girl who ruined the wedding. I felt like the only one who never lied. Marcus reached into the pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a small white box tied with a thin ribbon. Nothing fancy, just plain paper, a quiet kind of gift. I hesitated before taking it. Loud rooms and loved lemon cake. He was one of the few people who never looked at me like I didn't fit the frame. And now, this letter. Just a line, but it said more than anyone in my family had managed in years. I sat there with the paper in my hands, the silence around me suddenly heavier than ever. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen, not as a daughter or a sister, just as myself. And maybe that was reason enough to go. The venue was a glass-walled greenhouse tucked just outside the city, filled with white roses and golden lights that floated like fireflies above the guests. Everyone was dressed in shades of champagne and blush, sipping cocktails and laughing like nothing in the world could touch them. I arrived quietly. No announcement. No family greeting me at the door. I wore a simple navy dress I'd bought secondhand and did my makeup in the back of a taxi. I slipped into the last row during the ceremony, hoping no one would notice. But part of me knew they would. My presence wasn't loud, but it was unexpected. I sat in silence as Olivia walked down the aisle, radiant and glowing. She looked like someone who had everything. For a brief second, I felt proud of her. And then I looked at my mother's face, smiling, teary-eyed, entirely unaware of me sitting behind a pillar. Or maybe not unaware. Maybe just unwilling to see. In that moment, I realized what I had always known. I was not a guest at this wedding. I was an outsider passing through a story that had never included me. It was during the cocktail hour when she found me. My mother. She approached with that carefully rehearsed smile she wore at public events, the kind that said everything was perfect even when it was. She held a glass of rosé in one hand and adjusted her pearls with the other, like she was preparing for a performance. I nodded politely, bracing myself for whatever came next. She leaned in close, her perfume sweet and sharp like wilting flowers, and with a softness that made it sting more, she whispered, "You ruined her wedding just by showing up." I didn't flinch. I didn't speak. I just looked at her and nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something I had always known but never heard out loud. Then I turned, walked past the hors d'oeuvres, the string quartet, the carefully arranged seating charts, and out into the evening air. I didn't look back, I didn't say goodbye. I wasn't angry. I was done. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt something close to relief. The air outside was cooler than I expected. I stepped off the stone path and into the gravel lot, the sound of my heels sharp against the quiet. After a few steps, I bent down and slipped them off. The ground was cold, rough, grounding. I walked slowly, carrying the shoes in one hand like they belonged to someone else. In the distance, I could still hear laughter echoing from inside the glass walls. Toasts being made, music starting up. A perfect celebration continuing without interruption. I kept walking, past the row of cars, past the glowing entrance sign, past the idea that I had ever truly belonged in their version of family. I didn't cry. I didn't let myself spiral, I just breathed, deep, steady, unsure of what this moment was turning into. "Go ahead," he said, "it's not much." I untied the ribbon slowly and opened the box. Inside was a single slice of lemon cake. Real lemon, not that sugary kind. Moist with a bit of zest on top. I looked up, eyebrows raised. He smiled. You once said it reminded you of your grandmother, that it tasted like summer and books and quiet. I told the caterer to make one, just one, in case you came. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My hands were suddenly still. I hadn't told that story to anyone in years, and yet here it was, a slice of memory in a white paper box. I held it like something sacred, not because of what it was, but because someone had remembered, really remembered. He didn't ask me to come back inside. He didn't suggest I forgive anyone. He just stood there, giving me something small and perfect, like proof that not all things in that world were fake. And for the first time that night, I smiled without forcing it. We stood there for a while, saying nothing, letting the noise from the greenhouse fade into the distance. The music had shifted into something livelier. Guests were probably dancing, clinking glasses, telling stories they'd forget by morning. Marcus didn't move, and neither did I. He didn't ask for anything, didn't suggest we walk back together or pretend everything was fine. He just let me be. Eventually, he nodded once, slow and respectful, and said, "I'm glad you came." Then he turned and walked back toward the lights. I stayed. I watched him disappear through the glass doors, swallowed back into the celebration. I could have followed. Could have stepped into the dance floor, smiled politely, let them pretend nothing had happened. But I didn't. Instead, I opened the box again, sat on the edge of a low garden wall, and ate the cake slowly, as if it were something holy. And maybe it was. Because in that moment, I wasn't the forgotten daughter, the outsider, the girl who didn't belong. I was someone who chose peace over performance, truth over tradition. I didn't need their forgiveness or their seat at the table. I had finally found enough strength in the silence to stop asking for what they were never willing to give. I left before the final toasts, before the first dance, before anyone realized I was ever there. I ordered a car and asked the driver to take the long way back into the city. The windows were down, the night air soft against my skin, and for the first time in what felt like years, I wasn't carrying the weight of being misunderstood. I wasn't angry. I wasn't bitter. I was just done performing for people who only applauded when I stayed quiet. And as we passed the last row of hills and the lights of the venue disappeared behind us, I whispered something to myself that I never thought I'd say. I am not their shadow. I am not their shame. I am not their silence. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is leave without explanation, not to punish them, but to protect the part of you they never took the time to understand. Let them keep their crystal glasses and choreographed memories. I chose something real, something still, something mine. And if you've ever felt like you didn't belong in a room full of your own blood, just know this. You don't have to earn space in a story that was never written for you. You're allowed to write your own.